Hello everyone, it's Dr. Paul Rose. I'd like to introduce you to my chickens. These are Mary and Antoinette, and they're going to be taking part in a behavioural experiment this morning to give you an idea of how we can look at physiological changes and motivational changes and how they impact on the responses that animals give. And then we can have an idea of some of the genetic controls of animal behaviour too. But this is a really nice example that kind of crosses over with how we can measure animal behaviour to collect data to answer a particular research question. And one of the things that we can do is provide animals with enrichment or things in their environment that they engage with that increase the performance of particular behaviours. So if we wanted to measure the importance of environmental enrichment, we could look at the baseline behaviours of these chickens, and then we could compare how the activity patterns change outside of baseline when we provide enrichment. So my chickens really love scratching around. They really enjoy playing with a substrate in their enclosure and when they're allowed out in the garden, because this gives them extra activities to do and it promotes naturalistic behaviour patterns. So if I wanted to set up an experiment, I could measure the chicken's behaviour during normal conditions, and then I could measure the chicken's behaviour when I provided them with environmental enrichment. So imagine that I have collected some data and I have looked at what my chickens do normally. I've got percentages of time for scratching and foraging, preening, dust bathing, feeding, resting, perching, all of these different things that the birds can do themselves. So what I'm going to do now is provide them with some enrichment, and then we'll consider how this influences the chicken's behaviour, how it's motivated to get them to perform particular types of behaviour, and what this means from a biological psychology perspective. So here are my two chickens in their enclosure, and you can see that they've got perching that they sit on, and they've got a range of substrates that they can dig through, and we give them things like cabbage leaves and stuff like that that encourages them to forage naturally. Here is their bag of enrichment, which are just leaves that I have collected, and they love this because they dig through the leaves and it allows them to perform a wider range of behaviours than normal. So I'm going to give them the leaves, and then we're going to look at how that influences the behaviours that we can see, and then we can discuss that from a particular physiological and motivational perspective. So in goes my bag of leaves, taking out the stray pine cone. And I'm not going to spread this around, I'm going to leave it in a big pile, taking out the bit of tin foil as well. And we're going to see what the chickens do with the enrichment. So you can see they're highly motivated to scratch through the enrichment that has been provided to them. And we can get an idea of the amount of time that they will spend on these particular behaviours and how motivated they are to perform this extra scratching. So we can measure the effect of the enrichment on their time activity budgets. And then we can also look at how motivated they are to perform this behaviour based on how much time they spend on that behaviour compared to under baseline conditions. How much more do they enjoy the scratching behaviour compared to the other behaviours that they have to perform when maybe they don't have the outlet for performing that particular activity? We can also look at the changes in the individual physiology of the animal and how that's influenced by the environment around them. So the bright red comb and wattles you can see on their faces gives us an idea of their underlying physiological state. When chickens are in different physiological states, for example, maybe when they're not laying or when they're too hot or too cold, the comb and wattles change colour. They become paler outside of the laying season, and they become a brighter red inside of the laying season. So here we've got a really nice example of a physiological change within the chicken's body that we can view externally. And that might be one of the reasons we can use to explain the different types of behaviour that we see. For example, if the chicken is spending more time sitting in her nest box, or she's spending more time making a nest, and that correlates with the colour of her comb and wattles, there is a nice example of the physiological influence on behaviour. But what about the genetic control of behaviour? What does this enrichment example tell us about the genetic control of behaviour in the domestic chicken? Nobody teaches a chicken to scratch for food. Nobody teaches it how to scratch through the leaf litter like these two birds are doing now. That's an innate behaviour that the chicken is hatched with. So that's an instinctive activity that is under genetic control. And yes, its behavioural performance is promoted by the environment. So when the chicken is provided with a substrate that it will dig through, it will perform that behaviour for more of its time. But it's genetically controlled because it will perform it whether or not the extra substrate, the extra stimuli is there. I don't have to tell the chickens what to do, it's innate and instinctive. So enrichment tells us a lot about how animals engage with the environment around them, what they need to perform naturalistic behaviour patterns, and how motivated they are to perform key activities that come from their wild ancestors. This links really nicely to the psychological influences on well-being, because if animals, and this includes the human animal, are highly motivated to perform particular behaviours, and these behaviours have fitness or adaptive benefits. For example, the more leaves you turn over, the better you are at foraging, and therefore the more efficient you are at finding food. You're going to want to perform that behaviour. So by providing enrichment, by measuring its effect, and by seeing how it influences the animal's time compared to baseline, we get a good idea of well-being. We can understand the motivational states that link to well-being, and therefore we can improve the animal's overall quality of life. So we can potentially look at stress responses to chronic and acute stress, as well as beneficial challenge that we call eustress when we use enrichment. Perhaps animals are chronically stressed by an impoverished or barren environment. Perhaps they're performing abnormal behaviour patterns. By providing enrichment, we are able to enhance the animal's environment and give it a wider outlet of things to do. We increase the performance of particular behaviours. Acute stress, i.e. it's got to work harder to find food because the food is hidden under the enrichment, is a positive challenge, and therefore the animal can solve that problem, the stress level declines and hormone levels go back to normal. So these positive challenges that allow animals to perform a wider range of behaviours are really useful for improving welfare and well-being, because they encourage more performance of more behaviours that give the animal more control and more choice of what to do within its situation. And we know that control and choice link directly to positive psychological responses and positive well-being in the animals themselves. How might these data on animal behaviour and the responses to the environment, the provision of enrichment, changes to motivation, how might this be used to understand the psychology of the animals and how their well-being is improved by the enrichment provided? Let's imagine we have some form of abnormal repetitive behaviour and we have some form of beneficial activity. We've plotted our beneficial activity and we've plotted the amount of time the animal spends performing the abnormal repetitive behaviour. And we can see that the beneficial activity is at relatively low levels and that the abnormal repetitive behaviour seems to peak and trough around that beneficial activity. We'd like to give the animal an opportunity to perform this beneficial activity because ultimately that will improve its quality of life, it will give it more control and choice over its environment, and ultimately it will ensure that it can perform all of these highly motivated behaviours that we know are good for welfare. So we provide some enrichment, which I've indicated here with the green cross. And we can see that there is an increase in the beneficial activity. The animals are engaged with the enrichment. They're performing a wider range of behaviours perhaps, or they're spending more time on that particular behaviour that gives us an idea of a positive welfare state. And likewise, we can see an original decline in the abnormal repetitive behaviour once the animals start to engage with the enrichment. But as the enrichment becomes boring, or as the enrichment becomes used up, as the animals lose interest in it and their motivation to engage with the enrichment declines, so they resort back to the performance of the abnormal repetitive behaviour. And therefore we can suggest that the enrichment has only had a short-term influence on their psychological well-being. They've gone back to performing this abnormal repetitive behaviour as a chance or an attempt to try and cope with the environment. So we don't want this. We want our enrichment to have a longer term effect on these beneficial activity patterns. We want the enrichment to reduce the animal's stress responses to things that it feels are beyond its control. We want to ensure that the enrichment provides positive stress, positive challenge, and the animal feels more in control of its environment. So maybe we manipulate the type of enrichment. Maybe we do the enrichment different, we provide it in a different fashion. And we see that the enrichment has the original initial sharp response, and as the animal's interest in enrichment declines, it actually ends up going back to the enrichment time and time again, because actually now there is something about that enrichment that does keep promoting these positive activity patterns. And by encouraging more beneficial usage of the enrichment, perhaps it's more natural for the animal, perhaps it stimulates or encourages more different types of behaviour patterns because it's linked so much better to their wild ecology, we actually see a prolonged decline in the abnormal repetitive behaviour. So in this case, we know that the enrichment is more functional to the animal. It's done a better job at ensuring that the beneficial activity, the positive psychological well-being, has been improved for longer because the animal is now engaging with these naturalistic activity patterns to cope with its environment, rather than resorting back to these abnormal repetitive behaviours that we know are indicative of poorer welfare states. So it's always important to compare your baseline activity levels with the changed activity level based on what the enrichment tells you, but to ensure that the way in which the enrichment promotes those positive behaviour states is natural to the animal, it has a prolonged effect, but we see this peak and trough in how the animal engages with the enrichment. Remember, we don't want the animal to be excited all of the time, but we don't want the animal to resort back to the abnormal behaviours because therefore the enrichment's effect is probably very limited. So I hope my little enrichment activity here has shown you how we can measure some of these physiological and motivational changes in animal behaviour and how that links to their psychology. I also hope it's shown you how you can collect data on baseline levels, perhaps have a control, how you can manipulate the environment by providing enrichment, and how by collecting more data on what those animals are doing, you can get a nice idea of how the change to the environment influences the animal's motivation, it influences its time budget, you've collected data on what the animal is doing, and therefore you can infer from this any genetic control of behaviour, as well as any physiological changes that might be influencing behaviour too. And you could also look at different stress responses, acute or chronic stress, as well as positive challenge, measure the positive influences of this, again inferred from behaviour, to work out the animal's current welfare state in that environment. So from me and Marie Antoinette, I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you very much. And just in case you were wondering, my chickens are not forced to do research. Sometimes, if you're working at your desk in the summer with the back door open and you leave your desk for a short while, you might come back to it to find your poultry are merrily editing your Word document. True story. Have a good day.